The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the streets of Manhattan into glistening rivers under the dull glow of street lamps. Benjamin Hard's umbrella was useless against the drizzle, its fabric soaked through almost immediately. Yet he did not hurry. His tall frame moved with deliberate grace, every step measured, as if the rhythm of the city itself had synchronized to his heartbeat. Hard's dark coat clung to his broad shoulders, collar turned up against the chill, and the polished leather of his shoes gleamed faintly, even in the dim wet light. The Astoria loomed ahead, a relic of another era. Its stone facade, once regal, now bore the weathered patina of time. Neon lights flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the wet pavement. Benjamin's gaze swept the entrance, noting every detail, a chipped step, a door slightly misaligned, the faint scent of mildew that seemed to seep from the aged bricks. Observant as ever, he noticed a single bellhop idling near the revolving doors, his posture slack, hands stuffed into his pockets. Inside, the lobby retained a faded grandeur, a testament to decades past. High ceilings, ornate moldings, and heavy velvet drapes that had lost their richness. Benjamin moved quietly across the marble floor, the soft click of his shoes echoing in the otherwise silent space. He was here on request of a woman whose grief and desperation were palpable even through a phone call, Edward Lawson, widow of Edward Lawson, a young writer whose death had been ruled a suicide last week. She awaited him in the lounge, a small room tucked behind the reception, with a fireplace burning low, smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. Eleanor rose as he entered, a fragile figure draped in black, eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. She extended a trembling hand. "Mr. Hard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the muted patter of rain against the windows. I don't believe it was suicide. Please, you have to help me." Benjamin studied her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers fidgeted with the fabric of her scarf. He could almost read the unspoken story behind the trembling, a mixture of sorrow, fear, and suspicion. "I'll need to see the room," he said simply, voice calm, measured. There was no rush, only the quiet authority of a man accustomed to uncovering truths others could not even imagine. Eleanor nodded, leading the way. The hallway to Edward Lawson's room was narrow and dimly lit, each step creaking underfoot. Benjamin's eyes scanned the walls, catching the minute details, scuff marks, small scratches, faint impressions in the carpet. Every mark, every shadow told a story, if one knew how to read it. The door to the room itself was closed, the kind that locked from the inside. Eleanor hesitated before pressing the keycard, and it slid smoothly into the lock, revealing a scene that made Benjamin pause, not out of surprise, but as a professional recognition that all was not as it seemed. The room was neat, almost too neat. The bed made perfectly, personal items in their proper places. And on the far wall, scrawled in what appeared to be blood, a single line from Edward's unpublished manuscript: "The truth lies where no one dares to look." Benjamin's gray-blue eyes narrowed, the familiar spark of curiosity igniting behind them. Suicide, by definition, required logic and motive. This was neither logical nor consistent with despair. It was a message, a challenge, perhaps even a trap. He turned to Eleanor, offering a subtle, reassuring nod. "Stay here," he instructed, voice low but firm. "I need to examine everything. Every detail matters." As he began his meticulous inspection, from the scuffed carpet to the faint smear on the brass doorknob, Benjamin could feel the pulse of the room, the echo of events that had taken place. Somewhere in this hotel, in the quiet shadows beyond the flickering firelight, lay the first clues to a truth that someone, somewhere, wanted buried. The storm outside continued unabated, drumming against the windows like a persistent reminder that time would not wait. Benjamin Hard, private detective, stood calm amidst the chaos, preparing to unravel a mystery that would test not only his intellect but the very limits of his intuition. The door closed behind Benjamin with a soft click, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the thick, heavy drapes that blocked the view of the city beyond. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something older, metallic, that lingered in the corners. Hard's gray-blue eyes swept methodically across the space, cataloging every detail with a precision born of years observing people and places. The bed, perfectly made, seemed almost staged. No sign of struggle, no indication that anyone had lain upon it in distress. Yet subtle inconsistencies caught his attention immediately. The carpet near the nightstand bore faint impressions, as if someone had shifted back and forth repeatedly. A single chair was slightly pulled from its usual alignment, and a pen on the desk had been rolled halfway across the polished surface, leaving a faint mark in its wake. Benjamin crouched, examining the smudges on the floor. Dirt, perhaps from the shoes of a visitor, or something more intentional. His mind began to reconstruct possible movements, each step measured and deliberate. Nothing about this scene suggested a spontaneous act. Suicide, he thought, rarely left such meticulous arrangements. He moved to the wall where the message was written, "The truth lies where no one dares to look." The crimson letters were smeared slightly, as though the writer had paused mid-stroke, reconsidering. Hard traced the edges of the text with a gloved fingertip, noting its pressure and flow. Whoever had done this was precise, purposeful, and intimately familiar with the victim's work. The desk drew his attention next. Papers were stacked neatly, yet one sheet bore an odd crease. Benjamin picked it up, studying the handwriting. It was Edward's, but the ink seemed darker, wetter than the rest, as if someone had added to it after his death. He tapped a finger against his lips, deep in thought. Who would leave such a signature, and why? A faint draft stirred the curtains. Benjamin approached the window, noting the latch. It had not been opened recently. No sign of entry or exit through the exterior, no broken glass, no footprints in the puddles outside. Whoever had been here had done so without leaving an obvious path. He made a mental note: this was no ordinary crime scene, it was a puzzle deliberately left for someone like him. Turning back, he inspected the nightstand. A glass of water stood untouched, condensation pooling slightly on the coaster. Next to it, a small, worn notebook lay partially hidden beneath a lamp. He opened it, flipping through pages filled with sketches, scribbled notes, and fragments of unfinished sentences. Something clicked: these were not mere drafts. They were clues, perhaps even warnings, encoded in the minutiae of the author's obsessive mind. Benjamin's gaze fell to the small brass key on the floor, near the baseboard. It looked ordinary, but in his experience, ordinary objects were rarely so. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. Something about its smooth edges, the faint engraving almost worn away, whispered of secrecy. He straightened, eyes narrowing. The room, pristine yet subtly distorted, was a stage. Every object, every smear of ink, every misplaced item, intentional. The killer had wanted this to be found, yet only someone with the patience and perception of Benjamin Hard could decipher its meaning. The detective's mind raced, connecting disparate threads. This was not a crime of passion. Not a moment of despair. It was calculated. Carefully orchestrated. Designed to taunt and mislead, but also to reveal, if one knew where to look. Benjamin sat for a moment in the chair by the window, sipping his green tea, letting his thoughts settle. Each clue was a note in a larger symphony, a pattern waiting to emerge. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, unaware of the intricate drama unfolding within this small hotel room. Somewhere in this carefully arranged space lay the truth. Somewhere, between the blood-written message, the misplaced pen, and the cryptic notes of Edward Lawson, was the first step toward unraveling a mystery that would demand every ounce of Benjamin Hard's intellect, patience, and unerring intuition. And he was ready. Benjamin Hard left the hotel room with a quiet confidence, the brass key and notebook carefully tucked into his coat pocket. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. His mind, however, was fully occupied by the people Edward Lawson had left behind. They were the next layer of the puzzle, those who had shared his life, those whose words and actions could conceal motives and secrets. Eleanor Lawson led him to a small sitting area within the hotel, where a few of Edward's acquaintances had gathered. The first to speak was Julia Marks, a literary agent whose sharp eyes constantly flicked between Benjamin and the widow. She was dressed impeccably, as if she were attending a press event rather than a private consultation. "I don't see why this matters," she said, voice tinged with impatience. "The police have ruled it suicide. Edward's death is final." Her hands tapped nervously on the armrest, betraying the tension beneath her polished exterior. Benjamin noted it immediately, the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her gaze darted to Eleanor for approval. "Rules don't explain anomalies," Benjamin replied evenly, gray-blue eyes fixed on her. "There are details that don't fit. I intend to understand them." He observed the micro-expressions, the flash of fear when he mentioned anomalies, the subtle tightening of her jaw. People spoke with their bodies as much as their words. Next came David Klein, a fellow writer and Edward's closest friend. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his face. "You think Edward's death was murder?" he asked, though the question carried more curiosity than concern. Benjamin studied him carefully. Klein's posture was relaxed, but his eyes betrayed alertness, a constant readiness to respond, perhaps even manipulate. "I don't think anything yet," Benjamin said calmly. "I look at evidence first, and people second. But I observe everyone, Mr. Klein. Everyone has a story, and sometimes it's the untold ones that matter most." The final visitor was Margaret Flynn, a journalist who had covered Edward's recent book releases. She had a notebook in hand, pen poised, watching Benjamin as though she were testing his every reaction. "I heard the police found nothing unusual," she said softly. "Do you expect to?" Benjamin tilted his head slightly, studying her. Journalists often sought the drama, the angle that would sell. Yet beneath the poised demeanor, he sensed genuine intrigue, and perhaps fear. Fear of the truth hidden within Edward's manuscripts, and fear that someone, somewhere, would go to great lengths to ensure it stayed buried. He began asking questions, simple at first, then gradually more probing. Where had they been the night of Edward's death? What were the last conversations? Who had access to his work, his manuscripts, his thoughts? Each answer revealed cracks, tiny fissures that hinted at hidden tensions. Julia Marks grew defensive when asked about a late-night meeting Edward had scheduled. David Klein's casual tone faltered when questioned about certain unpublished chapters. Margaret Flynn's pen paused, mid-note, as though she had recorded something she wasn't ready to share. Benjamin noticed it all, storing every nuance in his mind. A tilt of the head, a flicker of the eye, a hesitant word, small, almost imperceptible clues that would later form a map to the truth. These people were more than friends or colleagues. They were pieces in a game, some willing, some unaware, and some actively concealing their hand. As he left the sitting area, Benjamin felt the first threads of a larger tapestry beginning to form. The room itself was a silent witness to the interactions, each word and gesture a brushstroke on a canvas that would eventually reveal the killer. And somewhere in this intricate web of relationships lay the motive, subtle yet undeniable, waiting for him to connect the final dots. The rain continued outside, a soft, persistent reminder that time pressed forward, indifferent to human schemes. Benjamin Hard walked back to the hotel lobby, already turning over every detail in his mind, aware that the puzzle was only beginning, and the most dangerous pieces were yet to move. Back in his small office at the Astoria, Benjamin Hard placed Edward Lawson's notebook and scattered manuscripts on the dark mahogany desk. The room smelled faintly of old paper and ink, mingling with the lingering aroma of the green tea he always drank while working. The rain outside had softened, the city's usual hum muffled by the thick clouds hanging over Manhattan. Benjamin's eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned every page with a methodical intensity. The handwriting was meticulous, almost obsessive. Sentences twisted and looped in ways that reflected the author's restless mind. Some passages were conventional prose, while others were fragmented, containing notes that seemed cryptic at first glance. Benjamin read line after line, pausing when something resonated, details of the plot that mirrored real events, peculiar mentions of locations, or subtle references to people who had vanished from public life decades ago. One paragraph, in particular, caught his attention. Edward described a crime that had occurred 20 years prior, a series of unsolved murders in a small town upstate, each victim found in circumstances eerily similar to scenes described in the manuscript. The timing, the method, the cryptic messages left behind, everything aligned with documented cases, but with subtle alterations that suggested intimate knowledge of the original events. Benjamin leaned back, tapping his finger against his lips. The implication was clear: Edward Lawson was not merely a writer inspired by crime. He was chronicling real murders, weaving them into fiction while embedding a map of sorts, a breadcrumb trail that, if followed correctly, could expose truths long buried. He turned to the notebook, where sketches and notes detailed settings, character behaviors, and cryptic symbols. Benjamin noticed that some symbols appeared repeatedly, marking passages that referenced certain victims or crime scenes. His mind began connecting the dots, forming patterns invisible to anyone who lacked his trained perception. A thought struck him. If Edward's writings mirrored real crimes, could his death be a warning? Someone aware of his research might have sought to silence him, prevent the next revelation. The blood-written message on the wall now took on a new meaning. It was not random, not a flourish of a disturbed mind. It was a deliberate message, a taunt aimed at those who dared to uncover the hidden truths. Benjamin carefully photographed the key sections and made notes in his own meticulous handwriting. He needed to understand the links between the manuscript, the unsolved crimes, and Edward's recent activities. Each page was a puzzle, each paragraph a potential lead. His attention shifted to a passage describing a clandestine meeting at a local theater. The description was vivid, almost too precise, naming streets, seating arrangements, even subtle background noises. Benjamin's analytical mind noted the discrepancies between the fictional narrative and actual locations. These deviations were intentional, perhaps clues only Edward could understand. Hours passed as he continued to decode the manuscript, the city outside now quiet, shadows stretching long across the room. Benjamin's mind raced, placing each element into a growing framework. There was a deliberate pattern, a carefully constructed trail leading to the truth. And he was beginning to see its shape. Finally, he closed the manuscript and rested his hands on the desk. The pieces were aligning, yet the puzzle was far from complete. Whoever had killed Edward Lawson was intimately familiar with both his work and the history it chronicled. This was no ordinary crime of opportunity. This was personal, calculated, and meticulously planned. Benjamin Hard's eyes hardened. The manuscript was not merely a collection of writings, it was a map, a warning, and a challenge. The challenge had been issued directly to him, the detective capable of seeing what others could not. And he intended to answer it, step by deliberate step, until the full story was revealed. Benjamin Hard leaned back in his chair, the dim lamplight casting long shadows across the stacks of manuscripts and photographs spread before him. Outside, the city seemed subdued, the storm that had gripped Manhattan finally giving way to a muted drizzle. Yet inside his mind, a tempest was brewing. The connections he had begun to see in Edward Lawson's writings pointed unmistakably to a case long buried in his own past, a case that had made him known to the authorities, a case that had first defined him as a detective. He retrieved an old file from a locked cabinet, the yellowed papers crackling as he flipped them open. The names, dates, and photographs were familiar, each detail etched into his memory over 20 years ago. A series of murders in a quiet upstate town, each victim found in circumstances similar to those Edward had chronicled in his manuscript. At the time, Benjamin had helped the police solve the case through meticulous reconstruction of events, profiling the perpetrator's psychological patterns, and predicting his movements. The case had been sensational, but it had left scars, on the victims' families, on the town, and on Benjamin himself. As he studied the old photographs, Benjamin noticed the subtle details he had once recorded meticulously, the angle of the victim's body, the placement of objects in the room, the faint traces left behind by the killer. The similarities to the scenes described in Lawson's work were chilling. Someone had mirrored the old crimes, or perhaps was using them as a blueprint. His mind raced. If Edward Lawson's death was connected to this past case, it meant that someone from that era had resurfaced. Someone who remembered Benjamin, remembered the precision with which he had unraveled the past, and now wanted to engage him again, not as a helper, but as a target in a game that had begun 2 decades earlier. Benjamin's hands rested on the file as he thought through the implications. Every detail, every deviation in Edward's manuscript, now seemed deliberate. The killer was communicating, perhaps even mocking, with an understanding that only Benjamin could decode. The past was no longer past, it had been carefully resurrected, entwined with the present in a dangerous intellectual duel. He recalled specific individuals from the old case, people who had been affected indirectly, family members of victims, colleagues who had assisted, witnesses whose lives had been irreversibly changed. Could one of them have orchestrated this? Or was it someone entirely new, someone who had studied the case and Lawson's work with obsessive precision? Benjamin's analytical mind began mapping out scenarios, cross-referencing old crime scenes with details from Lawson's manuscript. Each similarity, each divergence, was a clue. Some patterns were obvious, some subtle, like the pressure of a pen, the direction of a smear, the placement of a single object in a room. He felt a familiar thrill, the same that had propelled him through countless investigations before. But there was a darker undertone now. This was not merely an intellectual exercise, lives were at stake. Edward Lawson was dead, and the killer was still at large, possibly watching, waiting, orchestrating the next move. Benjamin's intuition told him that the solution lay somewhere in the interplay between past and present, in the minds of those who remembered and those who were willing to manipulate memory itself. As he closed the file and leaned back, his gaze settled on the rain-slicked streets below. Somewhere in this city, intertwined with the shadows of memory and manuscript, lay the truth. And Benjamin Hard, who had once unraveled a complex web of deceit 20 years ago, was now preparing to confront it again, armed with the clarity of experience, the sharpness of intellect, and the unyielding determination that had always defined him. The past had returned, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing challenge, and Benjamin knew that to solve the mystery of Edward Lawson's death, he would have to face it fully, without compromise or hesitation. The evening air in Manhattan carried a crisp bite, a reminder that autumn was already settling in. Benjamin Hard returned to his loft, the city's lights casting elongated shadows across the hardwood floors. The quiet solitude of his space, lined with books and the faint scent of green tea, offered him a moment of calm, or so he hoped. Yet before he could settle, a package had been left at his door. No note. No markings, save for the faint smudge of a fingerprint on the wrapping that someone clearly hoped would be overlooked. Benjamin examined it carefully, his gray-blue eyes narrowing as he noted the meticulousness of its presentation. Inside lay a single sheet of paper and a small, worn chess piece, a black knight, its edges chipped slightly, as if it had survived many games. The note was written in the same careful, almost theatrical script as the blood on Edward Lawson's wall: "The next move is yours. Fail, and the board will claim another pawn." Benjamin set the piece on his desk, tapping it lightly with his finger. The metaphor was clear, he was being drawn into a game, a calculated contest of intellect and foresight. Whoever had sent this package was familiar with him, understood his mind, and was confident enough to engage him directly. Over the next days, more messages appeared, each one carefully staged in places Benjamin frequented, a coffee shop he visited each morning, the library where he reviewed old files, even the small park near his loft. Each contained cryptic references to Edward Lawson's manuscripts, the unsolved crimes of the past, and subtle warnings. They were never overt threats, but their implications were unmistakable. Benjamin's approach was methodical. He photographed each item, catalogued every symbol, and compared them with notes from the past investigation and Edward's writings. His experience allowed him to decipher subtle cues, the choice of a chess piece, the placement of an envelope, even the type of paper used. Each was a message, each a challenge, and each demanded a careful, strategic response. He also began interviewing key figures again, subtly questioning them about any unusual interactions, any unexplained behavior. He noticed small, almost imperceptible reactions, the quick glance, the hesitation, the barely audible sigh. Each person was now part of a broader tableau, and the killer was orchestrating the scene to test him. Benjamin recognized a familiar pattern in the correspondence. The messages were not random, they followed a sequence, a calculated rhythm. It was as if the sender were mapping his reactions, learning his thought processes, gauging his limits. And the final move, he knew instinctively, would be personal. The game was dangerous, yes, but it was also exhilarating. This was the intellectual duel he had always relished, the one that forced him to anticipate every possibility, to analyze every subtlety, to think multiple moves ahead. Yet now, the stakes were higher than ever. Failure would not only mean failing the investigation but could result in more death, perhaps someone he had come to care about, perhaps even himself. Benjamin's gray-blue eyes hardened as he arranged the chess piece and note on his desk. The game had begun, and he would not falter. Every clue, every move, every subtle pattern would be scrutinized, dissected, and understood. And when the final play came, he would be ready. Because Benjamin Hard did not merely react. He anticipated. He observed. And he always, inevitably, saw the truth behind the facade. Benjamin Hard returned to the Astoria the next morning, the city shrouded in a muted gray light, as though the buildings themselves were holding their breath. His mind was already tracing the intricate patterns of the game, cataloging the messages and chess pieces left by the unseen adversary. Yet today, his focus shifted back to the people around Edward Lawson, their motives, their secrets, their lies. He began with Julia Marks, the literary agent whose polished exterior had barely concealed a nervous tension. Benjamin asked casually about Edward's meetings the week before his death, but he noted every micro-expression, the faint blanch of her skin, the subtle tightening of her lips, the way her eyes flicked toward the doorway as if measuring escape routes. I don't remember anything unusual, she replied, voice measured, but the hesitation betrayed her. Benjamin allowed a faint, knowing smile. She had told a lie, however minor, and it was a crack in the facade. Next, he spoke with David Klein, Edward's friend. Klein's casual demeanor faltered under subtle questioning. Benjamin noticed the twitch in his hand, the way his foot tapped with barely controlled impatience. "We were just discussing the new chapters," Klein said. "Nothing else." Yet Benjamin had already seen a manuscript tucked beneath Klein's arm, a draft he was unwilling to part with. Margaret Flynn, the journalist, provided another piece of the puzzle. She had recorded conversations and kept meticulous notes, some of which conflicted with previous statements. Her pen faltered repeatedly, and Benjamin knew she was holding back, perhaps to protect someone, or perhaps herself. Returning to the room where Edward had died, Benjamin examined the space once more. The blood-ridden message had been washed slightly by the cleaners, but he noticed faint traces, subtle smudges that suggested it had been altered or touched after being written. Combined with the behavior of the people around Edward, a pattern emerged. Someone had tampered with the scene, someone who wanted to direct suspicion, to mislead, to create a story within the story. Benjamin called the three together in the hotel lounge. His tone was calm but authoritative. "Someone here has manipulated events to conceal a truth. Not all lies are equal, some are deliberate, intended to mislead even the most careful observer. One of you has taken measures to control the narrative of Edward Lawson's death." He allowed a silence to stretch, watching them carefully. Julia Marks's fingers fidgeted with her scarf. David Klein's jaw tightened. Margaret Flynn's eyes flickered with something between fear and understanding. Benjamin presented a small but significant piece of evidence, a fragment of manuscript found hidden in Edward's notebook, one that only someone intimately familiar with both the room and Edward's writings could have handled. He placed it on the table, letting it lie between them. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Julia's defensive posture softened slightly, as if she were weighing whether to admit a partial truth. Klein's smirk disappeared, replaced with a tight-lipped concern. Flynn's hand trembled slightly, pen hovering above her notebook. Benjamin's gaze swept over them. The lie has a shape, a pattern. It cannot hide indefinitely. The truth will emerge, piece by piece, and the one who seeks to deceive will be revealed by their own actions. The first lie had been uncovered, not by confession, but by careful observation, deduction, and intuition. The adversary, whether hidden in plain sight or lurking in the shadows, was beginning to play openly, and Benjamin Hard knew that each revelation now brought him closer to the identity of the killer. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the city remained cloaked in shadows. Inside the Astoria, the first threads of deceit had begun to unravel, and Benjamin could feel the tension tighten around him like a noose. The game was far from over, and the next move would demand even sharper intellect, keener observation, and unflinching courage. Benjamin Hard stood, eyes narrowed, mind calculating. The first lie had been revealed, but many more awaited, each potentially more dangerous than the last. And he was ready. The Astoria was quieter than usual, the corridors bathed in the faint glow of the evening lights. Benjamin Hard moved with deliberate calm, every step measured, his senses alert to the smallest anomaly. Weeks of investigation, analysis of Edward Lawson's manuscripts, and observation of the people around him had brought him here, to the moment when theory and intuition would collide with reality. A message had arrived that morning, slipped under the door of his loft: "Meet me where the past and present converge." Midnight. Alone. The handwriting was unmistakable, deliberate, almost theatrical. Benjamin knew it was a trap, but he also knew that confronting it was the only way to draw the killer out. He arrived at an abandoned theater on the edge of the city, a relic of forgotten performances, its once grand marquee now flickering erratically. The interior smelled of dust, decaying wood, and faint mildew. Shadows stretched long across the seats and stage, each corner a potential hiding place. Benjamin's eyes scanned every detail, cataloging, anticipating, calculating. From the darkness, a figure emerged, slender, deliberate, moving with confidence. The killer's face remained obscured in shadow, but the tone of voice, calm and controlled, carried through the empty hall. "You came," the voice said. "I wondered if you would." Benjamin's gray-blue eyes studied the figure. "You've been playing a dangerous game," he replied evenly. "Messages, clues, manipulating people. But it's over now. The pieces have been exposed." A soft laugh echoed through the theater. Exposed? Or merely rearranged? The figure stepped closer, each movement precise. Edward Lawson understood, didn't he? His writings were a map, a puzzle. And you've been following it perfectly. But one wrong step, one misinterpretation, and the board claims another pawn. Benjamin did not flinch. He advanced slowly, mind racing. Every detail of the room, the faint creak of the floor, the subtle draft of air through a broken window, each clue fed his reconstruction of the scene. The killer's movements were deliberate but predictable, patterns in human behavior rarely deviated from expectation when under stress. "You knew my past," the figure said. "The old case, the lives it touched. Did you ever imagine it would return to you like this?" Benjamin's gaze hardened. "I anticipated every angle, every motive. You underestimated me. The past informs the present, yes, but it does not dictate it." A tense silence stretched. Then the figure's hand flicked toward a concealed object, a potential weapon, but Benjamin was already moving, his anticipation of the move flawless. With a single decisive gesture, he disarmed the assailant, pressing them against the wall, the shadows now revealing a glimpse of a familiar face from Edward's circle. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The killer had been among them all along, blending seamlessly into the world around Edward, manipulating the story, orchestrating the deaths, and testing Benjamin's intellect at every turn. "You underestimated the power of foresight," Benjamin said quietly, restraining the figure. "You assumed patterns could be hidden, that the past could remain buried. But I see what others overlook." The killer's lips twitched in a smile, resigned yet defiant. "Perhaps, you are the only one worthy of seeing it through. But remember, the game never truly ends. Even when you win, the board waits." Benjamin secured the figure and stepped back, surveying the empty theater. The game had reached its climax, the immediate threat contained, but the lingering tension remained. The challenge had been met, the killer revealed, yet the echoes of this intellectual duel would linger far beyond the walls of this abandoned stage. He exhaled slowly, the weight of weeks of observation, deduction, and strategy finally settling. The pieces had moved, the board was revealed, and for now, the game had ended, but only temporarily. Outside, the city remained indifferent, its lights flickering in the distance, the faint sound of traffic blending with the hum of memory and consequence. Benjamin Hard walked away from the theater, mind alert, ready for whatever move the board might present next. The interrogation room was quiet, illuminated only by a single overhead lamp that cast sharp shadows across the killer's face. Benjamin Hard stood across the table, calm and unwavering, his gray-blue eyes locked on the figure restrained before him. After weeks of deception, manipulation, and cryptic messages, the truth was finally within reach. "You've played a long game," Benjamin said, his voice measured. Edward Lawson's death, the messages, the manipulation of everyone around him, it all had a purpose. "But it ends here. Tell me why." The killer's lips curled into a faint smile, a mixture of resignation and satisfaction. "Purpose," they repeated softly. "You see, Edward understood what I could not say aloud. His manuscripts were a confession disguised as fiction. He exposed the truth of the crimes my family endured, the injustices no one would acknowledge. I wanted the world to forget, to leave the past buried. But Edward threatened that silence." Benjamin's mind traced the connections, recalling Edward's manuscript, the cryptic notes, the blood-written message, and the chess game metaphor. Everything aligned. The killer's actions were not random, they were a direct response to Edward revealing secrets long concealed. "You used fear to manipulate everyone," Benjamin continued, his voice calm but firm. "Threats, cryptic messages, the illusion of control. And you believed that involving me would test your plan, that I could be outmaneuvered." The killer's eyes flickered with recognition, a trace of respect for the detective's insight. "I underestimated you," they admitted. "You anticipated every move. Every pattern I relied on to control the game, you saw through. Edward's death was meant to be a warning to the world, but you," a pause, then a bitter laugh. "You see what I could not hide. You always do." Benjamin leaned forward slightly, connecting the final threads. "Your motive was fear, fear of exposure, fear that the past you wanted forgotten would resurface. You killed Edward not out of malice alone, but because he threatened the order you tried to maintain. You thought you could control the narrative, dictate the story, and use others as pawns. But every detail, every move, betrayed your intent." The killer's head fell slightly, a silent acknowledgement of defeat. Benjamin felt the familiar satisfaction of deduction fully realized. The intricate web of lies, manipulation, and carefully orchestrated events had unraveled in his hands. "And the past?" Benjamin asked quietly. "The events 20 years ago, the case that first made me known to the police." The killer's eyes darkened. "That was the seed. You solved the crimes then, exposed what should have remained hidden. I thought time would dull your memory, that the past would stay buried. But Edward's manuscripts reminded you, and me, of what could not be ignored. That is why I acted. To protect the secrets, to reclaim control." Benjamin nodded, understanding fully. The murder, the messages, the intellectual duel, they were all extensions of unresolved history, now colliding with the present. The killer had attempted to weaponize secrecy, but had underestimated the skill and resolve of a mind like Benjamin's. As police officers moved to take the killer away, Benjamin allowed himself a brief exhale. The game was won, the truth exposed. Yet the weight of the events, the knowledge of how fragile the balance between past and present could be, lingered in the air. He retrieved Edward Lawson's manuscript, placing it carefully in an evidence bag. The writings that had prompted murder, deception, and fear would finally serve justice. The past, once a shadow looming over the present, had been brought to light, and the killer held accountable. Outside the interrogation room, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Benjamin Hard walked through the halls of the police station, every step measured, every thought deliberate. The revelation had come, the game concluded, and for now, the balance restored. Yet he knew the city, the people, and the mysteries it harbored would continue to challenge him. Benjamin Hard was ready. He always was. The sun rose slowly over Manhattan, filtering through the tall windows of Benjamin Hard's loft. The city's noise began its familiar symphony, honking horns, distant sirens, and the rhythmic clatter of footsteps on wet streets. Inside, however, the loft was calm, bathed in warm light that contrasted sharply with the shadows of the past few weeks. Benjamin sat at his grand piano, hands poised above the keys. He played softly, a fragment of Chopin's Nocturne, letting the melody fill the room. The music, as always, provided clarity, a momentary reprieve from the constant calculations of a detective's mind. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the intricate web of human dramas that had unfolded in its shadows. The case of Edward Lawson's death was resolved. The killer had been apprehended, the motives understood, and the truth revealed. Yet Benjamin knew that victory in such matters was never absolute. People remembered, lives had been altered, and the past always left its marks. He placed the small brass key, recovered from the hotel room, into his collection of trophies, a reminder that every case carried both insight and consequence. He poured a cup of green tea and walked to the window, gazing down at the streets below. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the pavement glistening like black glass. Memories of the messages, the chess pieces, and the carefully orchestrated traps came to mind. The killer's mind had been brilliant, dangerous, and terrifyingly precise. Yet in the end, it had been outmatched by observation, logic, and intuition. Eleanor Lawson had expressed her gratitude quietly, her eyes still tinged with sorrow, but her trust in Benjamin's skill unwavering. Benjamin knew that the resolution could not erase grief, nor could it fully absolve the past. It could only illuminate the truth and prevent further injustice. He reflected briefly on the nature of his work, the delicate balance between intellect and instinct, the thin line between observation and intrusion, and the unyielding necessity of patience. Cases like these left a residue, subtle but persistent, a reminder that human nature was complex and often dangerous. And yet, he felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgement that the pattern had been discerned, the narrative completed, and justice served. Benjamin took one final look at the city skyline, the rising sun casting golden light across the rooftops. Somewhere, beyond the concrete and glass, mysteries persisted, puzzles waiting to be unraveled. And he would be there, observing, calculating, ready to face whatever challenge came next. He allowed himself a faint smile, lighting a cigar in quiet ritual. The smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling, mingling with the faint scent of old books and polished wood. In this stillness, he felt both the weight of experience and the clarity of purpose. Cases would come and go, some simple, some perilous. But Benjamin Hard knew one immutable truth: a mind disciplined, patient, and unwavering would always find the way. And so, as the city awakened, he prepared himself, not for rest, but for the certainty that new challenges would arrive, and he would meet them as always, with precision, intellect, and calm resolve. The past had been confronted, the present restored, and the future awaited. Benjamin Hard, detective, observer, and strategist, was ready.